On the morning of April 6, 1930, a frail 60-year-old man in a strip of homespun cloth walks down to the edge of the Arabian Sea, bends over, and lifts a small lump of dried mud and salt out of the sand. With that one handful, he has just committed a crime against the largest empire the world has ever known, and he has just begun the work of breaking it. His name is Mohandas Gandhi. Behind him stand tens of thousands of people who have walked with him for over 200 miles to reach this beach. Ahead of him stands the British Raj, an empire that at that moment controls a fifth of all the human beings alive on Earth. And the thing they are fighting over, the thing worth marching 200 miles for, worth going to prison for, worth dying for, is not gold. It is not oil. It is not land. It is salt. The same salt sitting in a shaker on your table right now. You have eaten it every single day of your life. You've spilled it and swept it away without a thought. It is, by any honest measure, the most boring substance in your kitchen. And it is soaked in more blood, more slavery, more taxation, more superstition, and more raw political power than almost anything else human beings have ever touched. But the story of salt does not begin on that beach in 1930. To understand why a pinch of white crystals could make an old man defy an empire, you have to go back, not hundreds of years, thousands, to a time when this ordinary mineral was rarer and more precious than the gold that kings wore on their heads. You have to understand something that sounds almost impossible today. For most of human history, salt was not cheap. Salt was treasure. In the ancient world, there were places where a small measured amount of salt would be traded for an equal amount of gold, ounce for ounce, weighed out on the same scales. There were African kingdoms where blocks of salt passed from hand to hand as money, cut into pieces to make change, exactly the way you break a bill. A handful of these dull white grains could buy a human life, and in many places it regularly did. Why? Why would anyone pay a fortune for the thing we now throw across our shoulder for luck and forget about? Because before refrigerators, before canning, before any of the machines that keep your food from rotting, salt was the only reliable weapon humans had against decay. And decay meant death. Think about what that actually means. A farmer slaughters a pig in autumn. Without salt, that meat is garbage within days, crawling and green, and the family that killed it starves through the winter. With salt, that same meat becomes ham, bacon, something that will feed them until spring. Salt was not seasoning. Salt was the difference between surviving the winter and not surviving it. A cellar of salted meat was a cellar full of tomorrows. That is the secret at the center of this entire story. Salt does not just make food taste better. Salt is what allowed human beings to store time, to carry food across oceans, to feed armies on the march and cities that grew too large to feed themselves. Every empire that ever ran on preserved fish, salted pork, and cured grain was, underneath everything, an empire that ran on salt. The crystals decided who could raise a navy and who could not, who could survive a siege and who would open the gates. And the people who figured this out did not have chemistry. They did not know about sodium or chloride or osmosis. They had no word for the invisible process by which salt pulls the water out of bacteria and stops rot in its tracks. They just watched and remembered and passed it down. In the salt marshes of ancient China, by some accounts more than 4,000 years before Gandhi walked to the sea, people were already boiling seawater in clay pots over fires to crush out the salt inside it. They didn't have the science, but they were doing the science anyway, one steaming pot at a time. The Egyptians took it further and darker. They discovered that a particular salt from the desert lakes, a mineral they scooped from dry lake beds, could preserve not just meat, but people. They packed the bodies of their dead in it for 40 days, drawing out every drop of moisture until decay had nothing left to feed on. The pharaohs you have seen in museums, the mummies that survived 3,000 years intact, survived because of salt. The same substance that saved the winter pig was used to cheat death itself and send kings into eternity dried and preserved. A pinch on your fries and a pharaoh's passage to the afterlife. The same crystal, doing both. So salt was powerful. Salt was precious. And precisely because it was precious, it became sacred. And where things become sacred, human beings start behaving strangely about them. Here is where it gets genuinely odd. Salt worked its way so deeply into the human mind that it became tangled up with the soul itself. Across cultures that had never met, that were separated by whole oceans, the same eerie ideas about salt appear again and again. Spilling it was a catastrophe, an invitation to evil, a summons to the devil standing at your left shoulder, which is exactly why, to this day, people throw a pinch over their left shoulder without knowing why they do it. You have probably done it yourself. You were performing a ritual older than most religions, and you thought you were just being silly. Salt was used to seal oaths because it did not spoil. It seemed eternal, and so a bond made over salt was a bond meant to last forever. Soldiers and holy men were bound by it. In parts of the ancient Near East, agreements were called covenants of salt, unbreakable by design. And because salt purified, because it preserved, because it seemed to hold corruption at bay, it was scattered on newborns, sprinkled on thresholds, and thrown at witches. There were serious people who believed a witch could not abide salt, that a woman accused of consorting with the devil would refuse to eat bread that had been salted. It sounds ridiculous now, but a woman's life could genuinely hang on whether she reached for the salted loaf, because someone was watching to see if she would. And then there is the word that follows you around to this day. You earn a salary. That word comes from salt. The old story says Roman soldiers were paid in salt, or given an allowance to buy it, and from that came the Latin word for it, and from that word came your paycheck. Now, historians will tell you the truth is murkier than the neat legend suggests, that we are not entirely sure how literal the salt payment ever was, but leave that debate to the footnotes. The deeper truth stands untouched. An entire civilization built the very idea of being paid for your labor around this mineral. The word for your monthly wage is a fossil, and buried inside it is salt. So we have a substance that is money, that is medicine against rot, that is holy, that is feared. Now watch what happens when rulers realize all of that at once. They realize that everyone needs salt. Every single person, rich or poor, must eat it to live, cannot survive without it, will pay anything rather than go without it. And when a government finds something that every human being is forced to buy, it does not see a mineral, it sees the most perfect tax ever invented. You cannot boycott salt. You cannot go a season without it. You will buy it or you will die. Which means whoever controls the salt controls the people. Empires understood this with chilling clarity. Ancient China ran a state salt monopoly so profitable it funded armies, built walls, and paid for the machinery of the state itself. And thinkers argued openly, in official debate, about whether a government had the right to grow rich off a thing its people could not refuse. That debate happened over 2,000 years ago, and we are, in a sense, still having it. But nowhere did the salt tax curdle into something as cruel and absurd as it did in France. And this is the part of the story where one strange, stubborn man walks onto the stage. So let me set the scene properly, because you are going to want to root for him. For centuries, the French crown imposed a salt tax called the gabelle, and the gabelle was not simply a tax. It was a monster of a law, twisted into a shape that seems almost designed to cause suffering. In many regions, every person above the age of 8 was legally required to buy a fixed minimum amount of salt from royal warehouses every single year, at prices the crown set as high as it pleased. You had to buy the salt, you had no choice, and you were forbidden from using that officially purchased salt to preserve fish or meat, because that required a different, more expensive salt, and using the wrong one was a crime. Think about that for a second. A peasant, cold, poor, scraping through winter, was legally compelled to hand over money he did not have for a mineral he could dig out of the sea for free, and then forbidden from using it the way he needed to, on pain of prison. The price of salt in one French province could be dozens of times higher than in the province next door, purely because of where an invisible tax line fell on a map. And so, inevitably, people started smuggling, carrying cheap salt across that invisible line and selling it to their starving neighbors. The crown called them faux sauniers, false salt makers, and it hunted them without mercy. Thousands of men, women, and children were thrown into prisons and sent to the galleys, chained to oars, for the crime of moving salt from one side of a line to the other. Into this world rides a man named Louis Mandrin. Mandrin was not a saint. He was a bandit, a smuggler, quick-tempered, wanted for murder. But when the tax collectors and the salt monopoly ruined his family and his region, he did something that turned him from a criminal into a legend. He raised a private army of smugglers, hundreds of armed men, and he did not sneak his contraband salt and tobacco in the dark. He marched it into towns in broad daylight, in open military columns, and he forced the crown's own tax officials, at gunpoint, to buy his smuggled goods. He humiliated them. He turned the whole rotten machinery of the salt tax into a joke, and the ordinary people adored him for it. For a brief, wild season, this one furious man made the most powerful monarchy in Europe look helpless over the price of salt. They caught him, of course. In 1755, they broke him on the wheel in a public square, shattering his bones one by one while crowds watched. He was 31. But they could not break what he had come to represent. The rage he tapped into over the gabelle did not die with him. It kept smoldering in the French poor for another 34 years, until it became one of the many fires that fed the French Revolution. When the revolutionaries finally rose up, the hated salt tax was near the top of the list of grievances they demanded be destroyed. A tax on a seasoning helped send a king to the guillotine. The clock on the old regime was already ticking. France just could not hear it yet. Now I need you to steady yourself, because we have been circling the darkness, and it is time to go into it. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Because to make salt cheap, to make it flow in the quantities that empires and armies demanded, someone had to produce it. And across whole stretches of history, that someone was a slave. Go to the middle of the Sahara Desert, to a place called Tagaza. There is almost nothing there. No trees, no water you would want to drink, nothing that grows. But beneath the surface lies rock salt, vast slabs of it. And for centuries, it was one of the most valuable substances in all of West Africa, because the great kingdoms to the south had gold but no salt, and would trade one for the other. So the salt had to be cut and hauled up and loaded onto camels, and the people who did that cutting were enslaved. A traveler who passed through in the 14th century described what he saw, and it reads like a vision of hell. There were no proper buildings because there was no wood and no stone, so even the houses were built out of blocks of salt, roofed with camel skin. The enslaved miners lived in salt, worked in salt, breathed salt, under a sun that could kill an unprotected man, hacking slabs out of the ground with primitive tools. They ate camel meat and dates carried in from far away, because nothing edible existed for hundreds of miles. And they died there. Many of them died there, in a village made of the very thing that was killing them, so that far away a nobleman could season his food and a merchant could grow rich. Picture one of them. Not a king, not a name in a book, just one man, whose name no one wrote down, swinging a tool at a wall of white rock in heat that steals your breath, knowing the salt he is cutting is worth more than he is, knowing he will most likely die in this place made of salt and never leave it. That man is the real cost of the crystals. Multiply him by generations, by whole trade routes, by centuries. This is the part that should make you angry. Because the cruelty of Tagaza was not some accident of nature. The desert was there, the salt was there, but the chains were a choice. Human beings looked at a mineral everyone needed and decided that other human beings were an acceptable price to pay for it. And Tagaza was not alone. All across the world, salt and human bondage grew up entwined. Salt was what made the transatlantic trade in preserved fish and salted meat possible, and those salted provisions were exactly what fed the ships and the plantations of the slave economy. Salted cod caught in the cold north was carried down to feed enslaved people forced to grow sugar in the tropics. The whole obscene machine was greased, at every stage, by salt. Take the salt away, and much of it simply could not have functioned. The crystals were the quiet, invisible thread stitching cruelty to cruelty across the entire ocean. Which brings us back, at last, to the empire we started with. Because the British, when they conquered India, looked at all of this history, all of these lessons about salt and power, and they learned them perfectly. India has a coastline thousands of miles long. Its people had made their own salt from the sea, for free, for as long as anyone could remember. You walk to the shore, you let the water evaporate in the sun, you scrape up the salt. It is one of the simplest acts a human being can perform, and the British made it a crime. They imposed a salt monopoly and a salt tax across India, and they enforced it with a machinery so obsessive it beggars belief. To stop the smuggling of untaxed salt, the British built, and maintained for decades, an enormous customs barrier that ran across the entire subcontinent. In its most complete form, it was a living hedge, a wall of thorny trees and bushes grown deliberately dense, stretching for over 2,500 miles, guarded by thousands of men, its whole purpose to stop poor people from carrying cheap salt from one side to the other. A wall of thorns longer than the width of the United States, grown across a whole country to protect a tax on salt. It was, for a time, one of the largest man-made barriers on Earth, and today almost no one has ever heard of it. It was allowed to rot away and vanish, as if the empire were ashamed of it. Sit with that for a moment. The British Empire grew a 2,000-mile hedge of living thorns across India so that a starving farmer could not carry a basket of salt to his neighbors, and the people running it wrote about it in their official records not as a shame, but as an achievement, in the cold administrative language of men balancing a budget. That is the tell. That is how you know. The blight of poverty in India had many causes, but the salt tax, the deliberate decision to tax a dirt-poor population for the one mineral no human body can live without, was not nature. It was policy. It was a choice, signed and stamped, made by men in offices who knew exactly what they were doing. And that is why, in 1930, an old man in homespun cloth understood something the empire had forgotten. He understood that salt was the one thing that touched every single person in India, rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim, high and low. He understood that a tax on salt was the empire at its most naked and its most vulnerable, a place where its cruelty was too obvious to hide. So he did not attack the army. He did not attack the treasury. He walked to the sea, and he bent down, and he made salt. An act so small, so simple, that a child could do it. And by doing it, he told an empire of hundreds of millions of people that they did not have to obey. That is their story. It belongs to India, to the people who marched those 200 miles, and the millions who took up the same simple act of defiance behind them. No one else can claim it. And it turned on salt. The British beat them. They arrested tens of thousands. They clubbed unarmed marchers who would not even raise their arms to defend themselves. But the images went around the world, and the moral authority of the empire never fully recovered. A pinch of salt had done what armies could not. It had shown the whole planet that the emperor was cruel, and the emperor was afraid. So the next time salt runs through your fingers, understand that you are holding the same substance that funded ancient China, that mummified pharaohs, that broke French kings, and cracked the British Empire. But I promise you the story is not finished, because what salt does today is every bit as strange as what it did 3,000 years ago. Start with the shock that most of the salt made on Earth never goes anywhere near your food. Only a small fraction of it does. The overwhelming majority is devoured by industry, because salt is the raw material behind an astonishing amount of the modern world. Split it apart with electricity, and you get chlorine and other chemicals that go into plastics, into disinfectants that make your water safe to drink, into the manufacture of a huge share of everything around you. The pipes in your walls, the bleach under your sink, the very cleanliness of your tap water, all of it traces back, in part, to salt torn apart in enormous industrial vats. This dull white seasoning is quietly one of the foundation stones of chemistry itself. Then there is what happens every winter. In cold countries, entire fleets of trucks pour millions upon millions of tons of salt onto the roads every year to melt the ice, because salt lowers the temperature at which water freezes and turns a deadly sheet of ice back into harmless water. In the United States alone, well over 10 million tons of it are scattered across the roads in a hard winter. Think of that. A substance so precious it was once weighed against gold, now flung by the ton out the back of a truck onto a highway so your commute doesn't kill you. The crystal that kings hoarded is now the thing we grind under our tires without a thought. That reversal, from treasure to road grit, is the whole arc of this story in a single image. And salt still hides wonders. In Poland, there is a salt mine worked for centuries, and the miners who spent their whole lives in the dark carved a secret out of the very walls around them. Deep underground, they hollowed out an entire cathedral from the salt. Chandeliers cut from salt crystal, statues, staircases, altarpieces, floor tiles polished until they shine. Whole chambers of religious art, all of it salt, sculpted by ordinary working men who wanted something beautiful in the darkness where they spent their days. People go to weddings down there today, hundreds of feet below the ground, in a church made entirely of the mineral in your shaker. Salt is also woven into your own body in a way you almost never think about. You are, in a sense, carrying a piece of the ancient ocean around inside you. The salt in your blood, in your sweat, in your tears, is not decoration. Your nerves cannot fire without it. Your heart cannot beat without it. Every thought you are having right now, every word you are hearing, is electricity running through a body kept salty enough to conduct it. Too little salt, and you die. Too much salt, and it quietly damages your heart and your arteries for decades. The same mineral that let humans survive the winter now sits, in excess, among the leading hidden drivers of the diseases that kill us. It gives life, and it takes it, depending only on the amount. It always has. Here is a fact to carry out of this with you. That superstition about throwing spilled salt over your left shoulder, the little ritual you have done without thinking, comes from an age when spilling salt on the floor was spilling money on the floor. A genuine small disaster, and the devil, people believed, waited at your left side to take advantage. You are not being silly when you do it. You are repeating a memory of a time when these grains were treasure, a memory so deep it outlived the reason for it entirely. So think about that beach one more time. Think about the frail old man in the strip of homespun cloth, bending down at the edge of the Arabian Sea, while tens of thousands of people watch and an empire holds its breath. He reaches into the sand, and he lifts up a small lump of dried mud and salt, the cheapest, most ordinary thing in the world, and he holds it up, and with that gesture, he tells the most powerful empire in human history that it has already lost. He knew what you now know, that there is nothing ordinary about salt, that inside those dull white grains are pharaohs and slaves, kings and smugglers, a 2,000-mile hedge of thorns, and a cathedral carved in the dark. That the most boring thing on your table is one of the bloodiest, most powerful substances human beings have ever fought over, and that we are all, still, living inside its story. You will never look at salt the same way again. Now, I want to hear from you, so drop a comment and tell me which of these hit you hardest. The enslaved miners of Tagaza living and dying inside houses built from salt. The smuggler Louis Mandrin marching his contraband into town in broad daylight and being broken on the wheel for it. Or the 2,000-mile living hedge of thorns the British grew across India just to tax the sea. Pick one. Tell me why. And if there is another everyday thing on your shelf you suspect is hiding a story like this one, tell me that too. Because there is always another story. And it is almost never the one you think.